crystal chandeliers of Blackmore Hall glowed like captured stars above a sea of silk and diamonds. Laughter rose and fell in perfect waves. Champagne flowed. And at the center of it all stood Nathan Reed, Duke of Blackmore, raising his glass with that confident, practiced smile he wore like armor. To the continued prosperity of the Reed name, he declared, voice rich with pride. Our finances have never been stronger. The future of this family and this nation is secure. The gentlemen around him murmured approval, lifting their own glasses. Nathan's chest swelled. For once, everything felt right. Then the tall oak doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Elena Harper stepped into the light. She wore deep emerald silk that caught every flicker of candlelight. Her dark hair swept up with simple elegance. Her face was calm. Too calm. The room noticed. Conversations faltered. Fans paused mid-wave. Elena walked straight toward her husband, each step measured, unhurried. The click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound left. Nathan turned, still smiling. My dear, you look. If not for the secret loan I arranged for our bank 3 months ago, Elena said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence like a blade wrapped in velvet, none of you would be raising those glasses tonight. The words landed like thunder in a closed room. Every head snapped toward her. Nathan's hand froze. The heavy crystal glass slipped from his fingers. It fell, slowly, impossibly slowly, and shattered against the marble with a sound that seemed to echo forever. Red wine spread across the floor like spilled blood. No one moved. No one breathed. Elena stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on her husband's face. For 3 long years she had hidden in the shadows, protecting everything he claimed as his own. Tonight the mask had finally cracked. She spoke again, softer this time, but every word carried the weight of truth. I have watched you toast our success for years, Nathan. While you chased seats in Parliament and dreams of power, I sat alone in a locked room with ledgers and letters, keeping this family from ruin. Her gaze swept across the stunned guests. Every lavish ball, every new carriage, every donation that bought you influence, it all came from decisions I made in silence, because a duchess, they told me, should be beautiful, quiet, ornamental. A bitter smile touched her lips for the briefest moment. I was never ornamental. Nathan's face had gone deathly pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The man who could speak for hours in the House of Lords now stood speechless, staring at the wife he thought he knew. Elena took 1 step closer. Her voice dropped to a near whisper that somehow reached every corner of the vast hall. I am done hiding. She turned slightly, addressing the entire room with quiet dignity. From this night forward, the bank that saved the Reed fortune will no longer operate in darkness, and neither will I. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers erupted like sparks on dry tinder. Nathan finally found his voice hoarse and broken. Elena, what have you done? She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time in their marriage, he saw something raw and painful in her eyes. What I had to keep us from falling. She turned and walked away, the emerald silk whispering against the marble as the crowd parted before her like water. Nathan remained rooted in place, broken glass crunching under his shoe, red wine staining the hem of his trousers. The proud Duke, who had just toasted his own greatness, now looked like a man watching his entire world tilt on its axis. In the heavy silence that followed, one terrible truth settled over Blackmore Hall. Everything he believed was his had never truly belonged to him at all. And the woman he had married, the quiet, graceful Duchess he barely noticed, had been carrying the weight of his legacy on her shoulders for 3 long, invisible years. The morning after the ball, Blackmore Hall felt unnaturally quiet. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, but the warmth didn't reach the long corridor leading to the east wing. Elena Harper stood before the heavy oak door that had remained locked for 3 years. Her hand rested on the brass handle. She hesitated, just for a breath. Then she turned the key and pushed the door open. Inside the private banking office smelled of old paper ink and polished mahogany. Ledgers lined the walls like silent soldiers. A large desk sat in the center, covered with neatly organized documents. This was her world, the one no one had ever been allowed to see. She sent notes at dawn. By 10 o'clock, 5 of the most important banking partners had arrived, their faces tight with curiosity and unease. I built the auditing system that caught every leak before it became a flood. She paused, her gaze shifting to Julian Ashford, who sat near the back, his face already flushed with anger. And I stopped my husband's younger brother, again and again, from draining the funds through his gambling debts. Julian shot to his feet. "You have no right to speak of me like that in front of these men." Brooke Reed, seated beside him, lifted her chin, her voice sharp with indignation. "Elena, this is unseemly. A duchess does not involve herself in ledgers and loans. You will make us the laughingstock of every drawing room in London." Elena looked at her sister-in-law for a long moment. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, weary sadness. "I have spent 3 years protecting the very reputation you fear losing, Brooke. While you planned balls and Nathan chased political favor, I sat here every night, alone, making sure this family did not collapse." Nathan's throat worked. He tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck. Memories flashed behind his eyes. Nights he had come home late, praising himself for securing the family's future, while Elena waited in silence upstairs. He had never once asked what she did with her days. Isabella Thorne sat quietly in the corner, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The widowed friend gave Elena the smallest nod of support. No words. Just the steady presence of someone who understood what it meant to be dismissed by the world. Elena turned back to the partners. "Every signature you trusted, every decision that kept this bank alive, came from this room. From me." She closed the ledger with a soft thud that seemed louder than it should. Nathan finally spoke, his voice rough and uncertain. "Elena, I signed those papers. You thought Ryan Cole handled everything." She finished for him gently. "But Ryan only wrote what I told him to write. You never asked questions. You never opened the door." The silence in the room grew heavier. One of the older partners cleared his throat. "Your Grace, this changes many things. It changes everything," Elena said. She looked directly at Nathan now. Her eyes held pain, but also a quiet strength that made his chest tighten. "I am tired of carrying this alone. I am tired of pretending I'm nothing more than a pretty face at your side." Her voice softened almost to a whisper. "So I've made a decision." She lifted a thick document from the desk, the proposal for a large new loan that could secure the family's position for years. "I will not sign this loan unless you agree to learn Nathan. Truly learn. Not as a duke giving orders, but as a man willing to understand what I have built in the dark." Nathan stared at her, stunned. His pride warred with something deeper, fear, shame, and the first fragile stirrings of respect. Julian laughed bitterly. "You would risk everything just to prove a point." Elena didn't look at him. Her eyes remained on her husband. "I am not proving a point," she said softly. "I am asking my husband to see me, for the first time in our marriage." The room held its breath. Nathan's hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the ledger still open on the desk. Pages and pages of careful numbers, her handwriting, her calculations, her quiet victories. For the first time, the proud Duke of Blackmore felt truly small. Elena waited, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. She had exposed everything. There was no going back. And in that heavy, trembling silence, the invisible ledger had finally been opened, and nothing in their world would ever be the same again. 3 weeks had passed since the locked door was opened. Nathan Reed sat alone in the dimly lit library at Blackmore Hall, staring at a single letter that had arrived that morning. The seal belonged to Lord Harrington, a ruthless political rival with hungry eyes and deeper pockets. The words inside were simple, yet they carried the threat of ruin. I know about the hidden debts. Withdraw from the upcoming election, or I will make sure every creditor in London learns the truth by week's end. Nathan's jaw tightened. He would not be blackmailed. Not by Harrington, not by anyone. He remembered fragments of conversations, Elena's quiet remarks at dinner about interest rates, collateral, and risk. He had nodded politely, then half listening while thinking of parliamentary debates. Now he believed those pieces were enough. I can handle this myself, he muttered, folding the letter with shaking hands. He summoned his own contacts. He drafted a carefully worded response. He even met with 2 junior bankers speaking with forced confidence about restructuring certain obligations. He used Elena's phrases, but not her precision. It was a mistake. By the next afternoon, whispers had turned into panic. Creditors began calling in smaller loans. The bank's reserves trembled. And in the chaos, Julian Ashford saw his chance. He slipped into the outer office and forged another withdrawal, larger this time, feeding his gambling habit while the family's foundation cracked beneath them. Elena learned of the crisis at dusk. She stood in the doorway of the banking office, her face pale but composed. Mr. Theodore Lang waited beside her, a thick folder of legal documents in his arms. Isabella Thorne had come too silent and watchful. Nathan looked up from the desk where he had been frantically reviewing papers he barely understood. His eyes met Elena's. For a moment, anger flashed across his face, the old pride refusing to bend. I was trying to protect us, he said tightly. Elena stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. You were trying to protect your image, Nathan. There is a difference. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quiet disappointment in her tone cut deeper than any shout. Mr. Theodore Lang spread the documents across the desk, precise charts, sealed affidavits and clauses Elena had insisted on drafting years earlier, each one a quiet shield she had built in secret. Elena began to speak, guiding the emergency meeting with calm authority. She explained the exact weaknesses Harrington had exploited. She showed how Nathan's vague responses had signaled uncertainty to the market. Every word was measured, every gesture deliberate. Nathan sat frozen, forced to watch. He watched his wife dismantle the damage he had caused. He watched her point out the forged withdrawal by Julian and the cold calculation in her eyes as she ordered it blocked. He watched the partners slowly shift their attention from him to her. And then the worst truth surfaced. One of the bankers mentioned a casual conversation at a recent gentlemen's club. Sophia Lang had been there. Nathan had drunk too much that night, boasting about his clever financial maneuvers to impress her. He had repeated Elena's words, the ones she had spoken softly to him over candlelight, without understanding their weight. The information had reached Harrington. Nathan felt the floor tilt beneath him. He remembered the night clearly now. Sophia's laughter. His own foolish pride, the way he had wanted to feel powerful in front of a woman who saw him only as a duke, not as a man. Shame burned hot in his chest. It wasn't just anger at Harrington anymore, it was horror at himself. Elena, his voice cracked. I gave them the weapon. I didn't even know what I was handing over. Elena paused mid-sentence. She looked at him across the desk, her eyes glistening with unshed tears she refused to let fall. You never asked, she whispered. You never wanted to know. The room grew still. Even Julian, cornered and silent in the corner, seemed smaller. Elena turned back to the council. She stood straighter, her shoulders steady despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying the weight of every lonely night she had spent protecting them all. I do not need your respect as the Duchess of Blackmore. I need your respect for the work I have done, the work that has kept this bank and this family alive. Her words hung in the air like a challenge and a plea at the same time. Nathan rose slowly from his chair. He did not step forward to take control. He did not speak to defend himself. Instead, he moved to stand just behind her right shoulder. He said nothing. But for the first time, he looked at his wife not with confusion or pride, but with something raw and aching, a dawning realization, a quiet hunger to understand the woman he had married and never truly seen. Elena felt his presence behind her, warm, uncertain, and finally attentive. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something fragile and real. Outside the windows, London's evening fog rolled in thick and silent. Inside the room, the poison debt had been exposed, and the man who had helped spread the poison now stood witness to the woman who had spent years creating the antidote. The invisible ledger had spoken, and Nathan Reed, for the first time in his life, was truly listening. Rain fell softly against the windows of the modest country house on the edge of London. Isabella Thorne's private residence stood quiet and unassuming far from the glittering lights of Blackmore Hall. No chandeliers, no titles announced at the door, only the truth. Elena Harper had chosen this place deliberately. Inside the small drawing room, the air was thick with tension. The full banking council sat around the long oak table along with the largest creditors, men whose fortunes were now tied to the Reed name. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across worried faces. Elena stood at the head of the table, dressed in deep midnight blue. Her hands rested lightly on a thick stack of ledgers, the real ones, the ones Nathan had never been allowed to see until tonight. She looked at each man in turn, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of every sleepless night she had endured. Gentlemen, if we do not act tonight, the Reed family will lose everything within 6 weeks. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Nathan sat at the far end of the table, invited only as an observer. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap. For the first time, he was not the Duke giving orders. He was simply a man watching his wife command the room with a quiet power he had never witnessed. Elena opened the first ledger. Her fingers traced the columns of numbers she had written herself in the small hours of the morning, year after year. She spoke slowly, clearly, laying bare the fragile state of their finances, every risky investment, every narrow escape, every quiet decision that had kept the bank afloat while the world believed Nathan was in control. Then Mr. Theodore Lang stepped forward. With steady hands, he placed a set of legal documents on the table, irrefutable proof of Julian Ashford's latest attempt to forge signatures and move a massive sum overseas. Julian's face drained of color. "You can't prove, we already have," Elena said softly, cutting him off. The signatures were clumsy. The dates do not match, and the trail leads directly to your gambling debts in Whitechapel. Brooke Reed, seated beside her brother, opened her mouth to defend him. Her voice trembled with familiar indignation. "Elena, this is family matter. You have no but." As Mr. Lang continued reading the cold evidence, Brooke's words faded. She stared at the documents, then at her younger brother, and slowly, she fell silent. The truth was too heavy to argue against. Nathan sat motionless, his eyes never leaving Elena. He watched her guide the discussion with precision and grace. He saw how the creditors leaned forward, listening intently. He saw the respect slowly replacing skepticism in their eyes, and with every passing minute, the weight of his own blindness pressed harder against his chest. Memories flooded him nights. He had dismissed her quiet suggestions at dinner, mornings he had left for Parliament without asking what she did with her days, the way he had smiled proudly at balls while she carried their entire world in silence. Elena paused. She looked directly at Nathan across the long table. Her eyes held exhaustion, and something deeper, a quiet ache that had lived inside her for 3 long years. "I am tired, Nathan," she said, her voice low but steady enough for everyone to hear. "Tired of carrying this burden alone. Tired of protecting a legacy while pretending I'm only decoration." She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the ledger. "But I am still willing to hand it all back, if you can prove you are worthy of it, not as the Duke of Blackmore, not as a man of title and ambition, but as a husband who is finally ready to see the woman who saved everything he claims to own." The room grew deathly quiet. Nathan's throat tightened. His heart hammered against his ribs. Pride, shame, fear, and a sudden overwhelming tenderness warred inside him. He rose from his chair. Slowly, without a word, he walked around the long table until he stood before Elena. The powerful Duke, the man who commanded respect in Parliament and ballrooms, lowered himself to one knee right there in front of the entire council, not in public shame, but in private surrender. He looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Elena," his voice broke, "I have been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." He reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently taking her hand in both of his. "I don't deserve your forgiveness yet, but I am begging you. Give me one chance, not to rule, not to control, just to learn, to stand beside you, as your husband, as the man who finally sees you." Elena's breath caught. For a long moment she simply looked down at him, the man she had loved in silence, the man who had hurt her without knowing, the man who was finally choosing to see. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Around the table no one spoke. Isabella Thorne watched with quiet approval. Mr. Theodore Lang lowered his gaze respectfully. Even Brooke sat frozen, stunned by the raw vulnerability unfolding before them. Julian remained silent in the corner, his face pale with defeat. Nathan stayed on his knee, holding Elena's hand as if it were the only solid thing left in his world. In that quiet country house far from the grandeur of Blackmore Hall, the reckoning had come. Not with anger, but with honesty. And for the first time in their marriage, the Duke of Blackmore was no longer standing above his wife. He was kneeling, ready to rise beside her. 1 year later, soft spring sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Blackmore Hall. The grand ballroom had been transformed. No lavish ball this time. No glittering crowd of nobles seeking favor. Only a small, intimate gathering, the banking council, a few trusted partners, and close family. White roses and simple candles decorated the long tables. The atmosphere felt hushed, almost sacred. Elena Harper stood beside her husband in a gown of soft ivory silk. Her hair was swept back, simply a single pearl at her throat. She looked radiant, yet there was a quiet strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. Nathan Reed took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. He stepped forward, his voice clear and unwavering as he addressed the small assembly. "Today we reopen this bank under a new name," he said, turning slightly toward Elena, Reed, and Harper. "Because the woman standing beside me is not only my wife, she is the co-founder and the true heart of everything we have built." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Some nodded. Others smiled with genuine respect. Elena felt her throat tighten. She glanced at Nathan, and for a moment their eyes held a silent conversation filled with everything they had survived. Across the room, Brooke Reed stood quietly beside Isabella Thorne. The sharp edge that once defined her had softened. In the past year, she had begun working alongside Elena, quietly managing the bank's new charity initiatives for widows and their children. She no longer argued. Instead, she watched her sister-in-law with a new kind of admiration. Julian Ashford was not present. He had been sent north to a remote family estate weeks ago, a working farm, where he rose before dawn to labor with his hands, learning the cost of every pound he had once tried to steal. The letters that arrived spoke of exhaustion and slow, reluctant growth. Nathan continued, his voice warm with quiet pride. "This bank stands today not because of my title, but because of the woman who protected it when I could not see." Elena's fingers tightened around his. She remembered the nights she had worked alone, the fear of losing everything, the loneliness that had once felt endless. Now, standing here in the light, those memories hurt less. Later, when the guests had gone and the hall grew still, Elena and Nathan walked hand in hand toward the main vault. Dawn was just breaking. Golden light spilled across the marble floors as they approached the heavy iron door that had once symbolized secrets and isolation. Nathan carried the master ledger under his arm, the same thick book he had never bothered to open in the early years of their marriage. They stopped before the open vault. Inside, rows of neatly organized documents and gold reserves gleamed softly in the early light. Elena turned to him, her voice gentle. "Show me what you learned." Nathan hesitated for the briefest second, an old habit of pride flickering and then fading. He opened the ledger, dipped the quill, and began writing under her quiet guidance. His handwriting was still a little uncertain, but he moved with care and focus. "You see here," Elena murmured, pointing to a column, "the interest must balance against the risk, always." Nathan nodded slowly, making the correction. "Like this, yes." She whispered, a small smile touching her lips. "Exactly like that." They stood close together, shoulders brushing, the warmth of shared purpose settling between them. Suddenly, light footsteps pattered across the floor. Lily Reed ran into the vault, her small dress fluttering, a sheet of paper clutched in her chubby hands. Her dark curls bounced as she stopped before her parents' eyes, bright with excitement. "Mama, Papa, look what I drew." She held up the drawing. Two figures stood side by side at a large desk. One held a quill. The other pointed at numbers on a page. At the bottom, in careful, childish letters, she had written, "Mama builds the walls. Papa learns to hold them." Nathan's breath caught. He knelt down, taking the paper with trembling fingers. Tears shimmered in his eyes as he looked at his daughter, then up at Elena. "She sees us," he said softly. "She sees what we're becoming." Elena reached down, brushing a curl from Lily's forehead. Her heart swelled with a tenderness so deep it almost hurt. Isabella Thorne and Mr. Theodore Lang stood at a respectful distance near the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Isabella's eyes were warm with quiet joy. "Mr.?" Lang gave a small, satisfied nod before they both slipped away, leaving the family in their private moment. As the sun rose higher, flooding the vault with light, Nathan rose to his feet. He placed the drawing carefully on a nearby shelf, then turned back to Elena. He took both her hands in his. "I spent years standing on your shoulders without knowing it," he whispered. "Now, I want to stand beside you, always." Elena looked into his eyes, eyes that finally saw her completely. The pain of the past was still there, but it had begun to heal, softened by patience, effort, and love. She leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against his. "The door stays open now," she murmured. "No more shadows?" Nathan smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached deep into his soul. "No more shadows," he agreed. Together they stood before the open vault. The heavy iron door swung wide, no longer a barrier, but a symbol of trust and equality. Sunlight poured in, touching every corner that had once been hidden. Elena Harper was no longer the silent shadow. She was the architect, and Nathan Reed had finally learned how to cherish the woman who had built their entire world. This story reminds us that late recognition can still heal old wounds, but only when we have the courage to set aside our pride and truly learn from the one who carried us in silence. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso Legal, Barra Disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.